just about, I reckon. And his book is here. And I can tell you it's a very interesting and good read. I totally recommend it. Dr. Pot, they call him. Been in jail half of last year. He's not uncompromising. I really appreciate that. Yeah, Doc.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see everyone here. It's good to see the rain too. Now, this is predominantly a talk about medical cannabis, but I'll also be talking about the industrial and political issues that are associated with it, because they're sometimes even bigger than the direct medical use. I've been involved in cannabis personally since I was a young teenager, but politically since 1988. And in fact, I got involved in cannabis not as a medical substance, and back in 1988 I didn't have a very clear idea of the awesome medical utility of various forms of cannabis. My original involvement with cannabis was actually industrial, and it followed I suppose we can thank Harris Dashawa. Does anyone know Harris Dashawa? It's a Japanese wood chipping company that operated out of Eden in southern New South Wales. And they were being provided with wood chips from our old growth eucalyptus forests at a rate of $60 a tonne, which was much cheaper than waste paper. So at that stage, our government was selling our old growth eucalyptus forests to Japan at less than the price of waste paper. Along with the subsidies on the road and the power, we actually ended up losing money on the deal. What really cracked it for me was seeing the damage they did to Brown Mountain and Mount Tantawanglo. These are temperate rainforest areas down in the Southern Highlands where I used to enjoy bushwalking. And one day I turned up for a bushwalk, and the only problem is there was no bush. Right, where there used to be little streams, where there used to be ferns, you know, what beautiful temperate rainforest looks like, there was nothing but chained log waste. Now, the first response for a hot-headed young man is to take up arms, like we'll go and burn their bulldozers, we'll go and stick ceramic rods in the trees. But with just a little bit of reflection, you realise that's a short term, and you're mostly working against the contractors, which are often in some ways innocent victims to this whole process. So I asked a simple question to which very few people could give me an answer, and that was, what did we make paper from before we started chopping down the trees? And in the quest to find that answer, I went to Fisher Library and did some research there, and that introduced to me the whole wide world of industrial hemp before the Prohibition. And with the Prohibition, the whole nasty world of the hydrocarbon takeover of our planet. To put the story really simply, it goes like this. Up until the beginning of the 1900s, most of the world's fibre, fuels and raw materials came from plants. We lived in a carbohydrate world. Remember, plants can take sunlight and carbon dioxide and create cellulose. And cellulose was the basis of the fabrics, of the paper, and all these things. It turns out, once you do the research, that cannabis hemp was the world's largest grown crop, and cannabis fibre was the world's largest traded commodity for hundreds of years, because the world's navies depended on it. Right? An average sailing boat took 60 tonnes of hemp fibre every 2 years to run. So the British, the French, the Portuguese, anyone that had a navy depended on hemp. And in fact, major wars, including the Crimean War, were fought over the control of hemp. With the rise of steam power and burning of coal, there was less need for hemp, and the industry went into a gradual decline. Are you all familiar with this history? Have you... Okay, has anyone here seen the documentary $1 Billion Crop? No one? Oh, that hurts me. All right. The $1 Billion Crop is a documentary we made in 1995 to try and rev up the government in moving towards having a legal hemp industry in this country. You really should watch it. It's called The $1 Billion Crop. It's available on YouTube, and it's very simple to access. Basically, the story goes like this. Up until the early 1900s, hemp was a major crop around the world, and it was the most traded commodity on earth. With the advent of steam power, its use declined. Also, there was no automation. There was no way of processing the hemp, as there had been with the development of a cotton gin. The cotton gin is just short for a cotton engine. but they called it a cotton gin. And it made cotton go from a very, very expensive fabric, only available to the rich, to a very common fabric because of the mechanisation. Up until that time, hemp was actually processed usually by Negro slaves in what was back-breaking work called breaking the hemp fibre using heavy boards to just pound the stalk and remove the bast fibre, which was used for textiles. In 1933, a man by the name of Mr. Schlichten invented a decorticator, a machine that would do for cotton what the gin had done and make hemp a very inexpensive and freely available material. In fact, the first literature that really changed my mind about hemp was an article in the Popular Mechanics called The $1 Billion Crop. And what it was, in 1937, when the pressure started building for a prohibition of cannabis, and most people accept the usual story that it was a dangerous drug, the reason for the prohibition of cannabis was to kill off the industrial uses of hemp textiles and allow nylon, which was invented by the DuPont Corporation in the mid-1930s, from getting a foothold in the world. Right? The evidence, the historical documentation of that is unequivocal, and you'll see some of it presented in $1 Billion Crop. But get that clear, cannabis was prohibited. The drug issues were always a smokescreen. And what they used the cannabis prohibition to do was to transit the world from a carbohydrate economy to a hydrocarbon economy. And just about every problem we have ecologically today, including the bushfires, even for the sceptics, is the fact that we moved from a carbohydrate economy where the sun provided the primary motive to a hydrocarbon economy where extractive industries provided the primary energetic driver of our economy. So the hemp decorticator came along in 1933. In 1937, there was a global prohibition on cannabis. During the Second World War, the Americans realised nylon wasn't quite as good as they thought, and there certainly wasn't enough of it. So they initiated the Hemp for Victory program. In 1941, they suspended the cannabis prohibition and required their farmers to grow cannabis. And in fact, they went from nothing at all to 240,000 acres a year during the Second World War. And a lot of American equipment, parachute rigging, fire hoses, fabric, threads, all sorts of things were made from cannabis fibre. In 1946, with the war crisis over, they re-banned cannabis and burnt down their remaining plantations. So it can be truly said that in the war on drugs, the first casualty is truth. So get that very clear. Now, as well as being a deregistered medical doctor, I'm also the Hemp Party Senate candidate at the federal level. And what we're attempting to do is create a viable alternative and a practical way of transiting from the current hydrocarbon-dominated world that we live in back to a really, and not to use a word in a cheap, a throwaway world, but a truly sustainable world. Right? I'll just spend a few minutes talking about my experiences with industrial hemp, because we finally, after a 7-year intense lobbying, got the first industrial hemp licensing back in 1998. And a few things became very obvious then. Firstly, hemp was a major biomass producer. You could produce well over 20 tonnes of dried stem material per hectare. But the advantages didn't stop there. It was a very efficient weed smothering crop. If you grew hemp at the right density, you could smother out the weeds without any need for herbicides. And because it's a self-mulching crop, have people seen hemp plantations, either on TV or in reality? You see these plants growing up at spaces of about 20 centimetres, and all the bottom leaves fall to the ground. It's called a self-mulching crop. And that forms a beautiful mulch layer. The canopy closure at the top end shades the underlying ground, reducing soil moisture losses and increasing the organic material in the soil. Any crop grown after a hemp crop will produce 20 or 30% increased yield with no other inputs. So it seemed to be ticking all the boxes. We also did some small experiments in northwestern New South Wales near Corindai at the edges of the cotton growing country. And even though it seemed that the boll weevil, which is the reason why cotton is such an ecologically destructive crop for the spraying to control the boll weevil, would eat the hemp plants. I watched them out in the paddock. They would start eating the hemp flowers and leaves, but after a little while they fell off and died. It was brilliant to watch it, right? So some of the terpenes and perhaps the cannabinoids themselves were toxic in the long term. So we had the real possibility of transiting from this highly destructive cotton monoculture, which is draining our western rivers and degrading the soil, to an actual co-culture where we could rotate the hemp and cotton and break up the boll weevil and dramatically reduce the need for agricultural chemicals. As part of this activism, we did a study tour to Holland, a somewhat more progressive country than us at the moment, and their government had contracted their equivalent of the CSIRO to do research in ways that they could reduce agricultural chemicals. And if you think agricultural chemicals are not a problem for our world, listen to this. The American Red Cross did a study a few years ago where they analysed the blood of 200 children, the umbilical cord blood. That's the blood that the child's born with as they exit the mother. And they found on the average there was well over 100 agricultural chemicals already detected in the cord blood of infants. There wasn't one child found that didn't have DDT present in their blood. Now, DDT had been banned 30 years before. Since then, I'm told, no one has been able to find a polar bear that doesn't have DDT in their system. Teflon, dieldrin, all these chemicals, phthalates from plastic, were basically universal contaminants. So we have a serious problem on our hands when the infants are born. There's been a lot of debate in the medical circles of whether there is or isn't an increase in chronic diseases in this country. Anyone who thinks there is not is living in some planet other than planet Earth. There has been a serious and alarming increase in many cancers, especially lethal brain cancer, glioblastoma. There's been a worrisome increase in autoimmune diseases, right? There's been an explosion of the incidence of autism, right? Any disease or condition which shows an 8-fold increase in incidence really should be ringing not a red light, but a whole series, a panel of red lights and sirens to boot. But they're taking the usual escapist view, oh, it's better diagnosis. Like, has anyone here seen a seriously autistic child? Right? You don't need better diagnosis to appreciate that there's something tragically wrong going on there. And it is an indictment of the highest order that our medical authorities at political and scientific levels are really ignoring what is a really severe and alarming epidemic, which is robbing our children of their future. Right? I can't stress that too highly. What we're playing for here is incredibly high stakes. Right? We're playing for the survival of the planet, not as a rock, because the rock will go on a long time before us ants, a long time after us ants have fallen off the surface of it, but the beautiful blue-green Garden of Eden, which we really should have here, right, is at risk at this stage. And I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that. Right? The idea of the human potential increasing each generation, which it has been to a point over the last 3 or 4 generations. The average life expectancy has increased, the general well-being of the population has increased, but all that has come to a grinding stop now, and it's very clear that the indicators are that this current generation that are now children will probably, unless something dramatically changes, live as long as their parents, and certainly not as well. Because we're seeing diseases that used to be the domain of elderly people, or at least people of advanced age, occurring in much younger and younger people. Like, even within my professional experience, I've been graduated in medicine in 1982, I've watched the age of breast cancer. Breast cancer was almost always seen in 50 to 70-year-old women. Now, late 30s are common, and even late 20s is not unheard of. Bowel cancer, again, was in the 50 to 70-year age group. The youngest one we've dealt with is 19 now. Right? I'm not a panic merchant and I don't panic easily, but if you're not panicking at this stage, you're not paying attention. That's the degree of seriousness which I consider that. Is there a way out of this mess? Perhaps, is all I can say. One of the issues, and I'm not only involved in cannabis, I'm involved in a number of different issues, but they all tend to be interrelated. Right? One of the big ones at the moment is fluoridation. Now, does anyone here support the compulsory fluoridation of the water supply? No. Yeah, that's a no, right? But yet it happens, right? From what I gather, Lismore, a year or so ago, had a vote at the council level as to whether they wanted fluoridation, and well into the 80%, the high 80s, voted against it. And the government removed the power of the councils to regulate these things, right? The old chestnut, but it stops dental decay. Even the people who, and the reason I'm harping on fluoride, there's a reason for this, even the people who support the fluoridation of water can only find data to indicate that it reduces dental caries by about 20 to 30% at the most, and the same can be achieved just by different dental hygiene. All of the European countries stopped fluoridating their water decades ago, and there was no increase in tooth decay. Right? There was no hideous young kids with all their blackened teeth, which is much more likely due to the excess sugar consumption. The fluoride that we're being poisoned with, and I use that word advisedly, we are being poisoned intentionally with this fluoride, is what we call fluorosilicates. It's not even a calcium fluoride, it's an industrial fluoride that's mostly sourced as a waste product of fertiliser manufacture from the Shanghai Rock Phosphate Company, and I've seen the receipts for this poison coming from China. It's very interesting. At this stage, we fluoridate the water to 1 milligram a litre. That's the rate of the fluoridation. In China, where in some areas, there's very high fluoride content in the rocks, and as the water percolates through the rocks, it picks up the fluoride, so that there's a high natural level of fluoride in the drinking water. What they found, when the fluoride level reached 3 milligrams in a litre, there was an obvious suppression of IQ, such that the villages were referred to as the villages of idiots, until the authorities did the testing and filtered the water and everything came back to normal. So the difference between 1 milligram, where it's just at the threshold of detectability, and 3 milligrams when there's a clear and obvious suppression of intellectual function. The 23rd scientific paper proving that there's a link between fluoride exposure and reduction in a child's IQ has been published recently in major medical journal. It's really beyond now, the science is beyond doubt that that is occurring. And in many ways, I think this country can't move forward as a lot of the other countries have with medical cannabis, with laws on recycling, with all sorts of environmental protection. We can't really move forward while the population is being artificially medicated with a sedative, mind-numbing drug. Right? Everyone rattles on about the pineal gland, and its function is not properly worked out, but there has always been a connection between the pineal gland and some higher spiritual aspect of humanity. Fluoride irreversibly calcifies the pineal gland, right? I've done about 1,200 coronial postmortems in adults, and you're flat out finding a pineal gland, right, because of the atrophy that's taking place. And while we've literally got a population of deadheads, it'll be very hard to gain the sort of political traction we need to move things forward. Now, Carol brought up the issue of the endocannabinoid system, and more people talk about the endocannabinoid system than understand it. And that applies to me at this stage. What we must say about it, it is a fascinating master controller of all the other systems. Every complex biological organism, going back to the sea squirts, has an endocannabinoid system. But there's a few mysterious elements about it I want you to consider. Firstly, do you remember the video that Carol showed? She showed synaptic movement the nerve impulse coming down the neuron, jumping across the synapse and then continuing, for instance, from the brain down to the muscles or from the sense organs up to the brain. That's the way the nervous system works. The endocannabinoid system is a retrograde system. I don't know if you noticed on that little graphic, but the endocannabinoids, the anandamide, the 2-AE and the 2-AG, were travelling against the direction of the nerves. And what they have a balance and control effect on all our systems. Right? When they mentioned that there was 2 receptors, CB1 and CB2, and perhaps some other G-coupled ones, there's currently up to 5 candidates for endocannabinoid receptors. So the system has an incredible complexity, but this is what you need to understand about it. Whatever the mechanisms are, however many receptors, this is what you need to understand. Most of the systems of the body that use transmitters have specialised organs where those substances are made. For instance, the thyroid gland produces thyroid in its follicles, and the thyroid hormone circulates throughout your body. It's all very clear and comprehensible. But the endocannabinoids, these anandamides, the bliss molecule, is actually created out of the cell membrane of the neurons or of the immune cells, created as required from the cell membrane itself, right? No one has the faintest idea what intelligence there is at the level of the cell membrane to create these regulatory molecules when they're needed, right? But this is one thing we do know. A cell membrane is built up from a lot of lipids, specialist fats, right? Now, if you don't eat the right lipids habitually through your life, your cell membrane is deficient. Just as if you make a house from bricks that are seconds, they're cracked and all the rest of it, you won't have a solid house. How can you possibly make something solid out of poor material? So let's say you've spent the last 30 years eating McDonald's and Kentucky and other sorts of legalised poisons that are dispensed out in Easy Street out there in the community. Your cell membranes are chronically malformed and simply don't have the right essential lipids to create the endocannabinoids. That is why we're having an epidemic of endocannabinoid deficiency. I look forward to a time when people don't need cannabis medicine, because cannabis medicine is not an essential medicine for people whose endocannabinoid system is working optimally. Right? Ralph McCullum, the godfather of cannabis science, christened 2-AG anandamide the bliss molecule, because the concept that was evolving then is when your endocannabinoid system is humming along perfectly, you're in a state of bliss. Just like a violin that's perfectly tuned, everything vibrates just as it should. So is that really clear? It is absolutely essential that you pay attention in the long term to the fats and lipids that you put into your body. It's regrettable that most people look after the engine oil in their car much more carefully than they look after the motor oil that goes into their body, right? Now, what is the way around this? Because the industrialisation of the food supply has made it more than difficult to actually do the right thing. Trans fats, which are possibly up there with the worst of the DDTs and things like that, in terms of interfering with the functioning of the body, have been almost ubiquitous through the food supply. They're not even listed on the ingredient package. Trans fats are fat molecules that have been bent out of shape by the hydrogenation process and by the heat that they apply to make them have a much longer shelf life, right? Food is meant to nourish us, not to preserve itself indefinitely on the shelf to the profit of agro-pharmaceutical companies. But that's what's happened. It took the activist movement decades here to get hemp seed legalised as a human food. Our endeavours started in 2002 with Phil Warner. He put in the first application to have hemp seeds legalised as a human food. And bear in mind, hemp seed don't have any psychotropic effects. They're purely nutritional. There is no drug in hemp seed, right? It's no different than a sesame seed or a pumpkin seed, except that its nutritional profile is exceptional. Those ones that I mentioned are nutritious, but the hemp seed is a balanced package of exceptional utility for human and animal nutrition. Just to put it really simply, hemp seed has more protein than steak, it has more omega-3 than fish, it has more B group vitamins than whole grains or beans, and has more minerals than most other plants. And this is in one nutritional package that's suitable for all ranges, right from a weaned infant right through to a geriatric. Right? So if you have one valuable message to take home from this weekend, is make hemp seeds a regular part of your diet. If you want to do yourself a really big favour, combine them with high antioxidant polyphenol content food like berries and better tree-ripened fruit in a smoothie, and make that a meal replacement for one of your meals. You got something to say? Well, firstly, luckily, they would have been irradiated if we listened to Fazant some years ago, but that was resisted extremely. And we're developing a local industry here too. So things like EM are all locally sourced. So no, the Canadians aren't irradiating it either. Right? Evidently, you only have to irradiate hemp seed if they come from a Kepra beetle endemic country. But no, it's not irradiated. Or no, the hemp seed, especially the Australian made, although if you can't get the Australian, any hemp seed is valuable. But it is a food that really should be part of everyone's diet and every child's diet. They're struggling enough as it is against a smog of electromagnetic radiation, against a global contamination of industrial poisons, and against a welter of junk food to try and have their brain develop in some sort of useful and productive way. So if you have anything to do with children or their parents, do them a favour and move in that direction. I think that's something that's very, very useful. What about cannabis itself and its use? Now, there's a lot of people talk about cannabis and a lot of experts talk about cannabis. The one thing I can say with great certainty is that there's still a lot to be learned, but the best person really to learn about cannabis is in an interactive way of the person who's seeking a therapeutic intervention and the provider of that cannabis. There's no place in this industry, I won't say an industry, sorry. There's no place in this business at all for dogmatism, right? Take epilepsy, for instance, right? Carol showed some examples of people who've done extremely well on CBD dominant cannabis. And bear in mind, there's different classes of cannabis. You have CBD dominant cannabis, you can have THC dominant cannabis, you can have a 50-50 ratio. The CBD dominant cannabis can be like a 20-to-1, like Charlotte's Web, or it can be a 3-to-1, like some of the more local varieties here. And the same goes with THC. And then overlying that is the issue of THCA and CBDA versus THC and CBD. Now, just to make that clear, raw cannabis or cannabis in a plant is in what they call the acidic form. So when we say THCA, it means the cannabis molecule with an acid, it's called COOH if you remember your school chemistry, right? And the same with CBD. So all the cannabinoids appear in the acidic form in the plant. But when they're heated, especially when they're smoked, they decarboxylate. Everyone balks at scientific terms, but decarboxylate means remove D, the carboxyl group, right? So it goes from THCA to THC. And there are times and therapies where decarboxylated cannabis is essential. But equally, there are many patients where raw cannabis has a better effect at a lower dose and is much better tolerated. Now, there's really no way of knowing in advance which patient is going to respond, especially within the epilepsies, because I've had great success, for instance, with the CBD dominant cannabis that's raw, one that's cooked. A THC dominant cannabis is used sometimes when others fail. So the logical approach, for instance, in epilepsy, the way I did it, if I have a choice in terms of what's available, is to start initiating the therapy with a raw CBD dominant cannabis. That will clean up a certain proportion, and that's rather easy. You've got them out of the way. If that doesn't help, or if the response is suboptimal, then you try a decarboxylated CBD dominant cannabis, and if that hasn't helped, you do the same with THC dominant cannabis. Firstly with slightly THC dominant and then with greatly. So there's about 4 different options you go through, and there is no other way of finding the optimal response to a cannabis medicine without trying it. The important thing too is the dose. Now, it should be well ingrained in everyone's minds with cannabis. You start low and you go slow in terms of the dosing, right? Now, you've heard repeatedly how safe cannabis is. So you say, well, why start low? Firstly, I'll talk about the safety of cannabis. And I can say, as an unassailable fact, there is no therapeutically active substance safer than cannabis. Right? Generally, in technical terms, you refer to what they call the LD50, or the lethal dose for 50% of the subjects. That's the dose that you can give which will kill half the population that you treat them with. Right? Now, something like alcohol, say you do doses say the social dose of alcohol is, say, 4 drinks, that's 40 grams of alcohol. If you give 400 grams of alcohol, you've got a good chance of killing half the people, unless they're confirmed long-term tolerant alcoholics. So the LD50 is 10. With most of pharmaceutical drugs, certainly the anti-epileptic drugs, the LD50 is between 10 and 20. So if you give 10 or 20 times the usual therapeutic dose, you're going to run into some severe toxicity and lethality. With the cannabis medicines, an LD50 has never been achieved. Right? And remember, we've done experiments with patients with serious advanced cancers where we injected something like 12 grams of resin of cannabis directly into their bodies, giving blood levels that were like hundreds of times higher than the new level, and they recovered and even achieved a significant anti-tumour effect, although we'll talk more about that in the future. In rats, they estimate that the LD50 might be in excess of 40,000, right? So even water has an LD50 of 20, right? So cannabis is in a safety area, just in another category altogether. So there can be no concern about toxicity. Now, everyone talks about educating the doctors, but even though I'm a deregistered doctor, I still receive the medical literature and sort of keep up to date with what the medical education sites are doing. And what I've noticed now in the last 6 months, there's been an increasing barrage of cannabis horror stories. Oh, you know, males who smoke cannabis end up with partners who miscarry at a higher rate. It may affect the liver function tests. So what I do when you see these sort of stories, you dig below the surface and say, well, what are they basing those things on? Take the CBD. The single case that they were referring to, the child in question was started on CBD medicine for intractable epilepsy. They were already on 3 other anti-epileptic medications, all of which were known to adversely affect the liver function, yet the headlines were CBD may be linked to abnormal liver function. Right? It's completely a nonsense, but it indicates that we're not dealing here with scientifically credible or scientifically honest people. We're dealing with an industry that's very much akin to what I call the fox minding the pigeons. So the people that are responsible for your health are very akin to the fox minding the pigeons, really fattening you up for what they can get from you. Now, I don't want to damn every medical practitioner in the country, and I certainly want to stand aside from the very useful role that surgical doctors play in this country. I mean, who'd be without an orthopaedic surgeon or someone to take out a burst appendix or any of these common sort of surgical emergencies? What I'm dealing with here are the oncologists and the people dealing in chronic pain. Right? Chronic pain in America, where the data is a little more collected, the management or the allopathic management of chronic pain has set in train what they call an opioid epidemic. Right? The number of people dying of OxyContin and other opioid drugs is in the tens of thousands every year. Tens of thousands of people are dying simply to get pain relief. And in Colorado, for instance, where the data's been collected, within 1 year of introducing cannabis for medical use and recreational use,
they don't have an alternative.
yeah, the suicide rate the domestic violence rate and the fatal traffic accident rate all went down. But yet the cops in this country, did you see the hysterical reaction by the police in Canberra? Oh, they've gone potty in Canberra because they're legalising cannabis. There'll be carnage on the road. There'll be blood on their hands. These are the sort of people we're dealing with when they know full well that the evidence indicates that as cannabis becomes more available and the legal impediments are removed, right, people move away from narcotics, they move away from alcohol towards cannabis, and the whole society can benefit. Okay? Now, there's a lot more to be said, but just in case we're not really getting to the sort of things you've come to hear, I'll take a few questions.
Who ordered lunch? Someone
Is that a question? Gee, I don't know the answer to that, Michael. Now, the question, don't make it an individual question, more a broad and a general question, because we can deal with one-to-one patients' issues outside. But what can I say? We're probably running out of time to take control of our future. Right? The longer we outsource our future to greedy corporations and venal politicians, the less likely we are to actually control where our future's going. I still feel in this country, and one of the platforms of the hemp party, and bear that in mind, the next election will come round soon enough. What do we want to do? I'll just talk briefly about industrial and how we can lift ourselves up out of this mire by our own bootstraps. For instance, in the common parlance, they consider there's what we call a zero-sum game. That means if one person profits, another person has to lose. Right? The only way forward as a cooperative humanity is for a win-win scenario. And generally, for instance, say in coal mining, you either dig a hole and sell the coal to China and make money for the corporation, and you just lose the forest and you lose the aquifers and all the other disasters that go with it. That is a zero-sum game. You either have the hole in the ground or you have the forest. With industrial cannabis, we can have a win-win. For instance, if we grow a plantation for paper making, we can have long-term sustainable industry, we can have quality employment, and I don't consider tourism a useful way to build a country's wealth. Right? Tourism is what I call geographical prostitution in many ways. You have these fat, stupid, loud, noisy people trampling over you, the best part of your country. I mean, there are valid travellers and things like that. I don't want to be too extreme on that, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. Right? Tourism is a fickle thing. It doesn't really have quality jobs. In some ecotourism there can be some value, but it normally destroys the resource that you're showcasing. If we have quality, truly sustainable industries like a hemp paper industry, we can have real industry, real import substitution. When we're making paper out of hemp, the byproduct is a range of fibre products called hurd. Now, are you all familiar with hempcrete as a building material? Hempcrete, we did the first hempcrete building in Sydney now about nearly 20 years ago. Hempcrete is a material that sequestrates or absorbs carbon dioxide, and whatever you think about the issue with carbon, the more plants we grow, the more carbon that's sequestrated, the better it'll be. The atmospheric carbon is rising in a measurable way. There's no time pretending it's not. It used to be something like 350 parts per million. It's now well into the 400s. The problem there, amongst other problems, leaving alone the greenhouse effect, is the oceans become acidified. And a tiny change in the pH of the oceans, the carbon dioxide dissolves into water and becomes carbonic acid. Right? A tiny change in the pH of the ocean will stop the calcification on all these tiny little life forces of which the whole food chain depends. Right? I'm not being an alarmist to say that the future of our planet at its current level of quality is in extreme hazard. We're facing extreme hazard. Right? And the problem is it's like someone standing on a railroad track with the train approaching, and there seems to be a disconnect between the threat, which is real and imminent, and the response, which is, oh, we need more studies, or we might look at that in a little while, right? I'm not a panic merchant, but if you're not panicking somewhat, you're not paying attention. But the good news is there is a way out of it. What about plastics? I think a couple of years ago, I met a marine biologist who discovered the Central Pacific gyre. Do you all know what that is? It's a continent-sized dump of plastic that's been scooped up in this gyre, this huge circular motion in the Pacific Ocean, and settled around Hawaii. In some of the outer islands of Hawaii, the sand on the beach now comprises 40% of microplastics. Right, let that sink in. If you pick up a kilo of sand on these beaches and analyse it, 40% is microplastics. Right? We were told there was something like 300 million, I think it was, I better check the figures there, of microplastics in this gyre. This is this big, soggy mass of plastic, which is now starting to strand. And remember, the plastics break up, but they don't biodegrade. The fish are eating them, and the phthalates that are in the plastics are having an adverse effect on the whole biological system in the ocean. The most recent work has indicated we've underestimated the amount of plastics in the ocean by a factor of 10, because the scoops they've been using to pick it up, to do the sampling, have had apertures that are far too wide, and most of the really dangerous microplastics are just going straight through these things, right? Now, I'd like to end on an optimistic note, but at this stage I'm struggling, right? There are a few things that are good. In the United States, for instance, finally, and just to prove the thesis that we said all along, that the drug issue was a smokescreen to get rid of the industrial hemp, America has legalised in some of their states medical and recreational cannabis years ago, but they've only legalised industrial hemp 2 years ago. But in that short time, the American farmers have taken the bit in their teeth, and there's somewhere between 30 and 60,000 hectares being planted now. And we can only hope that as that country deteriorates because of their increasing militarisation, there will be an upswelling of grassroots activism at the commercial level, with some of the factories there that can make particle boards out of hemp, paper processing, and we can use an industrial might, which so far has been used against the world in terms of weapons production, and move that towards a much better and greener future. When you watch the documentary $1 Billion Crop on YouTube, you'll see that in 1941, Henry Ford made a car out of hemp plastic. You'll see a picture of him hitting this car with a sledgehammer and rebounding. So here in 1941, we had a hemp plastic which was 1/6 the weight of steel, with 10 times the impact resistance. And that was buried by the industrial issues that wanted to do coal and wanted to do iron ore. Right? Hey? Yeah, no, not byproduct. The question was, did Henry Ford use hemp as a fuel? The issue there, they used to use steam pyrolysis to make an ethanol fuel. And Henry Ford initially intended to run the cars on ethanol or alcohol from biomass, right? That has some value. For instance, in Brazil, do people know about the gasohol program in Brazil? Brazil was facing bankruptcy. They have a huge sugar industry like we have, and the price of sugar is rock bottom, and it's not really a healthy commodity. But they started creating ethanol from their sugar crops, and it saved the country from bankruptcy because it moved them into not needing to import petrols. So ethanol is a viable biofuel, and it's completely suitable for diesel engines. Now, in this country, back in the Olympics, what was that, 1988? They ran a bunch of buses out of Homebush on diesel, which was a 10% blend of ethanol in with the diesel fuel. And they found that it reduced the particulate emissions by 40% and increased the fuel efficiency by 5%. So you use 5% less fuel and 40% less emissions. They did the same with the Action bus fleet. They ran another trial and got exactly the same results. And that was 15 years ago, and nothing has happened since. Right? That's what I'm saying. We're missing out on our opportunities. And opportunities only beckon once or twice, and if they're not seized, they're lost.
With the plant grown on the land, if the land is invested, if the land is invested with heavy metals, I've heard that the plant can actually.
Okay. You're talking about a mop crop.
My question here is, if the plant can do that, can it then actually, where do those heavy metals go?
Okay. There's a lot of misunderstanding, right? Because people tend to be a bit Pollyanna sometimes with cannabis. Oh, it's good for everything. So you can grow on contaminated soil and it cleans it up, right? I'm not really right over the recent research, but what I understand is this. Certain heavy metals and certain chemicals can be taken up by the hemp plant. But say you want to remediate a paddock, say there's been a toxic spill or something like that, you grow the hemp, but then you have to harvest the stalks and you burn them, and then you condense the ash, and it's really a way of siphoning the poisons out of the soil. It doesn't make them go away, right? You can't destroy matter. You can only move it from one place to another, right? And you couldn't, in that instance, in the first couple of cycles, use it as a food crop. Although partitioning between the stalks and the seed hasn't been clearly worked out. But the issue, and especially for radioactive contamination, it's quite feasible, and we're waiting for the Russians to do a little more work on this, to grow the hemp in the paddocks, harvest the hemp. You can use it, for instance, in certain building with hempcrete, because it doesn't matter too much if it's contained in that way, but generally then it's burnt and condensed. So instead of being spread over a hectare, you might have it condensed into one 44-gallon drum, which can then be stored safely somewhere. But it is a miracle plant, but it can't make rubbish just vanish. Yeah.
And so you start towards, do you know anything about vaporisation of hemp?
In the medical?
Oh, well, yes, it's the one we know first off with medical, but do you know anything about the ups and downs, the
Yeah.
upsides, downsides?
I mean, the vaporisation we're at risk at the moment with the Americans sort of on the warpath is a nuclear vaporisation. But if you're referring to cannabis vaporisation, what it is, I mean, you will know cannabis can either be topically applied, it can be ingested, it can be mucosally absorbed, it can be inhaled via smoke, or it can be vaporised. Now, the definition of vaporisation is heating the cannabis. It's a bit like water. Say you heat it, the vapour of the water will rise above it. Right? The temperature of combustion, usually when you have a joint, for instance, is something like 300 degrees C. But cannabis will vaporise. That means the volatiles, and cannabis is somewhat volatile, will rise out of the vegetable material at between 140 and 160 degrees. There it can be inhaled, but there's no combustion. So if you burn vegetable material, like a cigarette and things like that, you generate benzpyrenes and a whole lot of potentially carcinogenic or at least bronchially irritating substances. The idea of vaporisation is you vaporise the actives out of the plant, right, and inhale those without combusting the vegetable material, right? For certain pain states and things like that, vaporisation can be very, very effective. The absorption of orally ingested cannabis can be as low as 4 or 5%. So if you take like 50 milligrams, for instance, you're only getting like a small proportion of that absorbed into your system. You can increase that by having it with a fatty meal, especially with hemp seed blended up. But if you smoke it, you can absorb 10 to 15%. Vaporisation is probably the most efficient way of absorbing cannabis, and it can be as high as 20%. So it's horses for courses. It doesn't suit everyone. And for instance, for a child, for instance, it's not very practical. But for an adult, say battling lung cancer, or someone with a chronic recurrent pain syndrome, especially neuropathic pain, where they may be getting electric jolts and they need a very quick action, a vaporiser can be a very useful way to ingest it, right? Strange forces operate in this planet. Now, in the United States, where there's a lot of legal cannabis, there's been a horrible scare with the dangers of vaporisation. And it turns out that certain unethical producers were using an artificial form of vitamin E as a carrier oil. And that proved very toxic to the lungs, and a number of people died. But they're using that to smear vaporisation, right? I mean, I'm lost sometimes to wonder, is this just an unethical person, or is this a plan by the pharmaceuticals to actually denigrate what is a very efficient way of using cannabis? Now, as far as vaporisation goes, you can either vaporise a resin extract, or you can vaporise the flowers, the buds themselves. I'm not really keen on people mixing it with various oils and then vaporising that. I don't think that's a very wise choice, right? So the less you actually vaporise, the better. And the safest way is simply vaporise buds, right? Because there's no risk of contamination unless it's in the flower itself. Now, does that answer your question?
I was thinking about the pollution side though.
Pollution?
About burning things off from mock crops and, you know, we've just been through bushfires, so if you've got rows and rows of it planted, how does it burn and how much pollution does it make?
Yeah, are you serious? We've just lost something like 14 million hectares to burning the gum trees, and you're talking about like a quarter of a gram of cannabis. Yeah. Listen, I don't think we're going to have a greenhouse effect from people vaporising cannabis, if that's what you say. And especially if we use the stalks for some long-term thing like hempcrete construction. You know, sorry to be light about it, but it's not really an issue.
But if we planted a lot more, we would do a lot more to counteract the CO2.
Oh, are you talking at the industrial levels? Oh, yes. Absolutely. I'll just talk about that. Biosequestration is probably the most rapid way we can move forward on this whole conundrum. But what people leave out of the equation is the massive contribution to global pollution by the military. 50% of the world's pollution comes directly from the military. Right? The Americans are flying B-52 bombers, nuclear armed, constantly around the world. The missile testing that's going on, the aircraft carriers, the amount of fuel that the military uses accounts for at least half of the pollution, right? So leaving aside the military, just at the domestic level, if you build a house out of ordinary bricks and mortar, it generally exhales about 500 tonnes of carbon dioxide during its creation. Right, the making of the material and the assembling of that material, 500 tonnes per house. If you make the same size house out of hempcrete, the calculations are that